So this clip is intended to be a short discussion of the major big picture takeaways from the case. We're going to try to keep it short and sweet to the point too. The first point I want to make is that this has been an extremely polarizing case. There's no question about that. It's the kind of case that turns brothers against brothers, neighbors against neighbors. I've said, and I still maintain even at this point, that there are probably at least 80% of all Americans who aren't aware and don't really care about the case. But of the remaining 20%, with a portion on one side of the spectrum and a portion on the other side of the spectrum, the people at those ends are very passionate about the case. It's very polarizing, and it kind of goes hand in hand with the polarizing presidential campaigns and election that we've got going on right now. But anytime you see the kind of dynamic that's going on in social media right now, and has been for the last year basically, and during the course of the entire trial, and when you see people that are willing to go to downtown Portland and stay for the entire trial and set up camp basically and protest in favor of criminal defendants, that's highly unusual. And when a protest like that actually gains traction and grows legs over the course of 6 weeks, it just shows the kind of passion that's involved. There's no question this has been a very polarizing case. But at the end of the day, the jury spoke. It was a jury trial, and there were 12 jurors, and they spoke. They looked at all the evidence, and they found that all of the defendants were not guilty of any of the charges involved in the case. So, contrary to popular misconceptions, they found that this protest, which many had claimed was all kinds of things, at the end of the day, it was found to be a peaceful, lawful protest. And so what that means is that, among other things, one of the takeaways is that, at least for now, the First Amendment does remain intact. The First Amendment guarantees our right to freedom of speech, expression, to assemble, to protest, and to seek redress for our grievances. And at the end of the day, that's what the Oregon Standoff was all about. That's what the occupation of the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge was about. It was a protest in support of the Hammonds. And it was basically a demonstration based on what Ammon Bundy and others felt like were the failure of their ability to otherwise seek redress of their grievances through any other avenue. So ultimately, they staged a protest, they staged an occupation, and the jury found that in the process, the government did not meet its burden of proving that there was anything unlawful about the protest. And a lot of people have been very concerned because there were arms involved, there were firearms involved. The other thing that the case means, the verdict basically demonstrates that the Second Amendment remains intact, that in this country we still do have a constitutional right to have and bear arms, as long as we're not using them unlawfully or to commit other crimes. And that's really what it boils down to in a nutshell. There have been all kinds of discussion about all the threats and all the force and all the violence that people have attempted to claim was happening or was going to happen. But at the end of the day, the only violence that occurred was the violence that was inflicted upon Lavoy Finicum. There were no other shots fired. He was the only person killed. The government was not able to put on any evidence of any actual threats, any actual force, or any actual violence by the defendants in this case. And again, we need to contrast that with what the government has done. And I think it's really important to understand that from my perspective, it was a big overreaction from start to finish, and there was a complete breakdown of separation of powers between the federal government, the state government, and the local government in Harney County. There were no checks and balances whatsoever. In fact, in this case, the jury verdict has been the first check on government power that we've seen in the case from start to finish. And all of this came as such a big surprise to the mainstream media, certainly, and I think it came as a big surprise to Judge Brown. That's why she wasn't prepared for the reality of what to do with Ammon Bundy now that he had been found not guilty. So when Marcus Mumford argued that he, at that point, should be entitled to be released, she wasn't prepared for that. And the reason she wasn't prepared for it, and the reason that the mainstream media has been so shocked by the outcome, is based on their biases. Their biases have prevented them from seeing, from start to finish, that the government had put on a very weak and marginal case. In fact, the government's case was so weak that I would argue that there are very credible judges, who would have dismissed the case when the government rested based on failure to make a prima facie case. Their case was that weak. But at the end of the day, despite the lack of separation of powers between the federal, state, and local governments that resulted in the stop, for which there were no warrants, there was no probable cause, at the end of the day, that is the outcome of this jury verdict. It shows that there was no probable cause. There was no justifiable reason to stop these defendants for traveling to Grant County, which resulted in the death of Lavoy Finicum. And the last point I want to make, basically, in terms of a major takeaway from the case, there's been a lot of discussion about what happened with the jury. The fact that juror number 4 would basically send a note to the judge explaining that juror number 10 had stated at the beginning of jury deliberations that he was very biased, and that he had a background not only of working for the BLM, but that he was a current law enforcement officer with the Department of Corrections. And a lot of people have criticized juror number 4 for doing that. All I can say is this: from start to finish, juror number 4 is one of the only people who have demonstrated true leadership in this case. True leadership in standing up. And it's exactly the same thing that Ammon Bundy and the others were doing. They were standing up for their neighbor. They were standing up for the Hammonds. They demonstrated leadership, and at the end of the day, the major takeaway from the whole case is that when tried over the course of 6 weeks to a jury of their so-called peers, the jury found that they were not guilty. That's a wrap, and that's basically the major takeaways in a nutshell.